Well, hello, and welcome again to Front Row and to, I think, our most ambitious and most important podcast series yet, When God Became White, a topic that could not be more relevant and timely. Recording this in the second week of the second coming of the 47th President of the United States. And there's a whole lot of whiteness going on. Uh, Grace, you must have been prescient. You are prescient in thinking about this title and writing this book last year. So I want to say right off the bat, congratulations to you for giving us this rich resource, which is filled with topics of importance. I mean, you touch on many topics. So it's great to be working with you. Hi.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. This is really exciting. And I did not foresee what would be happening with the elections, but I think the book came out, during a good time so that many people who are struggling with what is happening today can kind of resort to books like mine. And there are others that are dealing with this topic of whiteness and racism and white privilege. So I hope that our discussion will be helpful for all the listeners and we can get into the hot topics today.
Yes, and I'm particularly grateful that you name it as the problem of Christian whiteness, particularly. A few years back, I was working with some young organizers from a group called Soul Force. These were non-binary people, and they said their issue is Christian supremacy. And me being me, I said, "Are you sure that you don't mean white supremacy?" And they said, "Aha, gotcha." Right? The two are linked, aren't they? And you link them so
Yes.
well here. I think we might begin actually with the service at the National Cathedral and Bishop Budd's comments, which created this enormous reaction, as though, what on earth is she talking about? God
Yeah.
of compassion and mercy? Where is that coming from? She must be woke. It was stunning. The extent of and then the extent of course, the viciousness. And I think you and I, as we get into the series, we should be aware that we're dealing with material that some people will dismiss as woke. It doesn't mean we're not going to do it. We're going to do it with verve, intelligence, and invitation to people who are listening and watching to join in the conversation, so to speak. So our topic is whiteness. Christian whiteness, but let's just start with whiteness and the toll that it takes worldwide in people, in relationships, in relationship to the planet. Uh, it's unnecessary suffering, even for the people who live within the whiteness bubble, who are kind of lost in that. So let's talk about some of the things we can make. You and I can make a list. I mean, right off the bat, the problem of organized violence and militarism comes to mind. Um, and let's go from there. Jump right in. What does whiteness do to create a toxic brew for the whole world and for each of
Yeah.
us?
Well, thank you for all that information. We are in this time when all of these topics that you just mentioned are going to be very important and in the news. So when I first wrote the book, When God Became White, I actually submitted it under the title of Whiteness, and it's published by InterVarsity Press. I wrote it after I wrote the book Invisible, and I thought, okay, from now on, it'll be one word book titles, because it's hard for me to remember all my book titles. So I submitted it as Whiteness, and then they said that it's such a vague topic or vague title. So they changed it to When God Became White. But the book is dealing with this notion of whiteness, and it is a socially constructed concept. Just like the idea of race, people believe that it's biological, that certain people are smarter or better or, more intelligent and better in all aspects of life. So that has been problematic. And we see this throughout history, during times of war, World War II, gathering of people because one group thought other groups were inferior. People would measure brain sizes and said, look, this XYZ group is less than human. So things like that have happened, and we know that that will continue to happen unless we tackle the issue of race, that it is not biological, that it is a social construct, and this concept of whiteness, that it is a social construct, which allows such things like racism to exist, that allows white supremacy to exist, as if everything is biological. So I think as Christians, you mentioned, white supremacy, Christian supremacy, these are all interrelated, intersecting, and we have to understand that these socially constructed words and concepts are used by Christians and by other people worldwide to say that one group is better than the other. And it is the white people. They're smarter, they're brighter, they're stronger, they are more divine or closer to God. That's a concept that Christians love to use than other groups. So this is an important topic that we need to talk about, especially under this new president, where you see it in real time, what is happening and what will continue to happen. So I hope that, Christians who are struggling and wanting to build a better world can tackle these issues, because the churches, it aren't exempt from it either. We see it in our churches, in our liturgies, in our prayers, in our hymn books, promoting white and whiteness. And it's so subtle that unless we are more aware, we may just think it's just part of Christianity. That is who God is. That is how human beings are. And we just accept it. So this is a big problem, and I'm glad that you're raising it, Peter, and happy that we're discussing it at this time.
We're going to go into every aspect of it. And it does boggle the mind, doesn't it? That something that is socially constructed and almost invisible because it's so normalized can
Yeah.
have such massive impact. I mean, I think of the form of capitalism that we have in the United States, which then was spread worldwide, a violent capitalism based on domination and extraction, as entirely rooted in this idea of white people as somehow anointed and able to possess and rule. Not to mention the misogyny and homophobia that you go into a great deal. Talk a little bit more about the normalization, the way whiteness gets centered even among people who are not white.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is a really, really important question. When I think about the concept of race, uh, and in the book, I go over how the construct of white people emerged. And so when we think about white people, um, they become the norm. So they don't have to think about race in the way that people of color or those who are labeled people of color have to think about it all the time. So for example, when Asians are born, so when I was born in Korea, we're not born and we think to ourselves, oh, we're yellow people. We don't think that way. And if you talk to Africans, they never think of themselves as Black people. We're just human beings. And when we immigrate to different places, like here in the US, where it's predominantly white, that's where the labels come. And so we're always aware that, okay, now we're called yellow people, or Africans are now called Black people, but these are just labels being used. And that's why when we're talking about this concept of whiteness, it gets embedded in our society, in our culture. And so people just aren't aware of it. They just think that's the norm, just as white people thinking that they are the norm and we are the people of color are on the outside. But we have to understand that these labels are created labels. For example, last summer, I spoke in Australia for about 5 or 6 weeks on this specific book. At one occasion, I was a speaker at their Indigenous Peoples Conference within the Uniting Church. And for Indigenous people, we had break time and people were talking to me. They said that the dark skin is a recessive gene. So over time, through intermarriage or through rape, etc., they become lighter and lighter. So many of them just look like, white-skinned people. But they said in Australia, it's not the Africans that are called Black people, it's the Aboriginal peoples who are called Black people. And regardless of their skin color, they can be white as any European from England. So understanding how these labels are used. And so Aboriginal peoples who are oppressed in Australia, labeling them as Black people is a tool to say, hey, you are not like us. It doesn't matter if your skin color is white. If you are Aboriginal, you are of a lesser kind of human being. So I think being aware of how these labels are used, so Koreans are yellow people, Black Africans are Black people, we just need to be aware. So even this concept of whiteness, because it is just part of our culture, it's part of Christianity, and it has been for so long, we feel it is the norm. So there's nothing to tackle, nothing to deconstruct, nothing to criticize, because that's the way it is. That's the way Christianity has been for the last 2,000 years. And it's only in the last blink of an eye within Christian history that theologians, particularly theologians of color and those who are working on liberation theology or constructive theology, are saying this is a problem. So let's tackle it, and the church has to deal with it.
Right. Right. I have to say, I'm pretty old now, and I was growing up in a very white part of the country in Wisconsin, and growing up as a male person, I took it for granted that everything I said and did would always be worthy of respect, right? And that has been true all my life. That's a kind of normalization that's poison for me, and certainly for other people, especially as I get older now. Everybody's holding doors for me and saying, "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." And it becomes actually kind of annoying. Um, we'll go into a little bit more of the male aspect of this, which you treat in depth in your book. I think right now, though, we might just reflect together for a minute on the newness of this constructed system of oppression, this massive tool of oppression that you identify as whiteness. And it actually does have a lot to do with the Christian story, doesn't it?
Yeah.
In the 17th century, when European colonization was rapidly taking over the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the Sugar Islands in the Caribbean, there was this controversy about whether enslaved people should be baptized, right? Because at that point, the planters, the white colonists, simply called themselves Christians. And the missionaries, including the Anglican Mission Society and the Moravians and a couple more, convinced the planters that it would be okay to baptize the enslaved people. There'd be no confusion about them actually being free. They'd be free only in a spiritual sense. But in that case, we need new language, because we can't use Christian anymore, because now the enslaved people are Christian. So there's that word, white, right? Amazing. Now that's 500 years, right? Less than 500 years that this construct has been in the world. In a way, I don't know about you, I take some satisfaction from that, because it means something that's recent, part of so-called modern history, won't be around, can't be around for the sake of humanity and the planet.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is correct. And, the book details how the enslavement, Christians and then the enslaved were non-Christians. That was a great way to differentiate people. There's always been a way, differentiating people, us and them. But that Christian and non-Christian was a great way because that's how they all were at one point until the enslaved converted to Christians and Christianity. And so it's interesting when you study in the US history that as the African enslaved people were converting, they weren't allowed to come into the white churches, so they built their own churches. And there were some Christians um, who ripped out pages from the Bible and said that here is the Bible, and those, about equality, all human beings were equal, no slave, no master. So those were ripped out. And some of those Bibles exist today. So, the enslaved people got a different Bible to read. So, once they started becoming Christians, a new label was needed. So, white people was a great term, white people, and then the enslaved were Black people. So, as you said, it's interesting. And we're hoping that, that's a recent part of our human history. And it depends how you're going to calculate human history. Some people will say millions and billions of years ago. And some people will say, oh, it's only 5,000 years ago. But anyway, it's not, it's a part of our recent history. So, I think being aware of these terms and how they are used to reinforce the status quo or reinforce white supremacy, the church needs to deal with it because the church itself has been white, European, patriarchal, heteronormative. And so, in a globalized world and the church kind of dying in Europe and in North America and rising in the global south, we really have to question the terms that we've used, the words for God, and, our liturgies, our prayers, everything that happens in the church, because there is it's been tainted. And, if I talk in those terms and people get uncomfortable, I just say, look at the history. I'm not making things up. You just have to read the history and how the church has developed and how the church treated people as they colonized different groups of people around the world.
We are going to problematize the church
Okay.
and its capacity to get it right as we go forward in this, because there's still momentum in the other direction, a good deal of momentum in the other direction, which is troubling. Just going back for just a moment to the centering of whiteness, there are still plenty of so-called scholars who want to make the claim that the only civilization worth paying attention to is European civilization.
Yeah.
That's still the case. I'm always put in mind of the time when I think it was Gandhi was asked what he thought of Western civilization, and he said it would be a good idea. I don't know if you're familiar with that remark, but
Well, yeah.
he was speaking to the richness of the civilizations of the East.
Yes.
But now, going back to this present moment, our capacity in this country to be aware of other cultures is actually going to be limited by law in terms of school curricula and so forth. So that's how serious this is. That's how important this conversation is.
Yeah.
And I think we're kind of drawing a little bit near the end of our first episode. But I really want to ask you again. This, in a way, is a culmination or a new level in your scholarship. And tell me about your motivations as you thought about this book, how it would build on your previous thinking. Would you do that? And then we'll pause and we'll resume the podcast in another episode.
Yeah. So my previous books, I'm dealing a lot with racism and sexism. So you'll see that in Embracing the Other, Invisible. all my spirit books. So, I was struggled with it all my life. So as a child of an immigrant living in the 1970s up in a small city called London, Ontario, in Canada, I had to deal with this racism every day of my life as I went to school, as I went to church, wherever I was going, into the supermarket, because people just made fun of people that looked like me. It was blatant to just call names in your face and do the eye pull and racial slurs. So dealing with it all my life, and then now, like 50 years later, um, why is there still so much racism? So that was another driving force to write this book because in the 70s till now in 2020, a lot has changed in the sense that people now know where Korea is. When I immigrated, nobody knew. They knew where China was and where Japan was, but these Canadian school kids didn't know where Korea was. They thought I was making things up. And I would cry and go home and tell my mother, there's no such thing as Korea, or I'm not a Korean. Because everybody said there's Chinese and there's Japanese, but no Korean. But now with globalization and there's K-pop, K-drama, mukbang is watching people eat food. That started in Korea. All these Korean movies, Parasite won the Oscar for Best Motion Picture. All of this happening, and why is there still racism? I didn't understand it. But I think studying it and understanding how whiteness works really helped me understand. So much of my work in writing and blogging is to help me understand. And in the process, it becomes a book. So that was the driving force to write this one. Why 50 years later are we still struggling with this? How are we going to get rid of it? So that's what drove me to write the book. And I hope a lot of white people will read it to understand what is happening and how, because I know a lot of white people have read it and, they have reached out and said that they never realized how they were participating in this. And so grateful for the book. So I'm hoping that more and more people will read it and more churches will read it together. And every book becomes a lens for the reader to make sense of the world around them and of their own lives.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. And I'll say this, as a white person, it's never too late for the white people to wake up.
Okay, thank you.
Now, let's say farewell for this first episode, and we're going to return to history in episode 2. We're going to talk about the project of conquest and how organized violence plays into this whole scheme. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me.